Peter McCutcheon reporting. So how far apart are the major political parties on agriculture, and who is best placed to take up the challenges of the next 3 years? I caught up with the Agriculture Minister and his Labor opponent earlier in Melbourne. Senator O'Brien and Mr McGauran, thank you for coming on Landline.
Glad to be with you.
Yeah, very good.
Mr McGauran, if I could start with you, the NFF has called for a new drought policy model based on mutual obligation, where there's more emphasis on getting farmers ready for a drought rather than emergency payments. Do you support that call for a totally new look at drought policy?
Yes, we've done a great deal of work in conjunction with the NFF in regard to incentives for farmers to better prepare for drought, whether it be fodder storage or the installation of silos and the like, and you may have to look at the taxation system and water storages, water efficiency. But at the moment we're concentrating on getting through this drought, and with the agreement of the NFF we've put to one side those future plans to prepare for the next drought. In the meantime, however, we've been unstinting in our support of drought-affected families, so much so that 29,000 farm families are presently receiving support.
Well, if Australia gets drier, droughts are going to be harder to manage too. So do you support a new policy so that farmers can build more resilient businesses?
Yes, and we've certainly been supporting farmers not just through the drought but looking to the future, getting the fundamentals right on farm but also through the whole of the supply chain, bringing industries together. So it's not as simple as to say that climate change is going to change forever farming in the future. We have to get through a drought and plan for the next one, but at the same time undertake all of those fundamentals that go to make up the profitability and commerciality of farming.
Well, do you think this drought is connected to climate change?
There's no scientific evidence that would prove that. What we know is that there's climate variability. We need to adapt to it. We've invested very heavily in climate adaptability. Climate change does pose very serious, even critical challenges for the farming sector, and we have to work our way through that over the period of the coming years.
And do you agree with the NFF, which says climate change is the biggest challenge for agriculture?
It's certainly one of the greatest challenges because it may very well determine how and where you farm. We've invested in looking at different varieties for different commodities, how you manage pasture, how you conduct your farm enterprise, but there are many other challenges. Getting young people into farming and into agribusiness. There's the issue of water efficiency, sustainability of the Murray-Darling Basin. There's also issues surrounding skilled and semi-skilled labour shortages. So we've got many challenges of the future, and climate change is amongst them.
Well, Senator O'Brien, do you think your drought policy is closer to what the NFF wants?
Look, I think that we've responded to what the farming sector has been saying to us for some time. Everywhere I go, farmers want to talk about climate and climate change and drought. I'd have to say that given that exceptional circumstances, a Labor initiative in 1992 was about preparing farmers, getting them ready for drought, that we've seen 11 years of simply sitting back and saying the settings are basically right, we'll just fiddle with them at the edges. There've been no commitments from the government to review the issues of climate change for farmers, and frankly that's because the government is essentially full of climate change deniers. And 3 weeks ago, when the National Climate Centre came out and talked about the relevance of climate change to the current drought and future drought, Mr McGauran was saying that he didn't really accept that there was a connection that had been established.
Well,
that's not my perception, and that's not what farmers are saying to me.
What I said at the time was that this is a CSR report that talks about how droughts might be longer by the year 2030, but this current drought, there's no evidence that it has been worsened by climate change. But we just take as an assumption that we've got climate variability on our hands. But Senator O'Brien's wrong. We've already invested $225 million for agriculture, climate change and climate adaptation. So he's coming late to the party. We've been doing it for several years, and in any event, nothing could have prepared any farmer for 7 years of the most punishing, devastating and widespread drought in Australia's history. So let's not abandon farmers and talk about climate change over the next 50 years when they're suffering now.
Well, we're not abandoning farmers at all. In fact, we put a $130 billion package on the table, which is about preparing farmers for the future of variable climate. There are some serious issues there. We're seeing, for the first time in 100 years, an El Nino event without 3 wet winter months. A first time, and the reason that a lot of farmers have problems at the moment was that they were told that they could expect at the end of El Nino a good season. The predictions were there, people had put in crops, people force-sold crops they thought they would get, now they don't have them. There are some serious problems out there, and frankly, I think this government has been sitting back and coasting on the issue of climate change. We've seen the issues now where only a matter of weeks ago the Cabinet refused to agree with Mr Turnbull to ratify Kyoto, and what more indication could you have that this government wants to run away from the issue of climate change? But I can say I sat down at a kitchen table at Wollowee in South Australia, about an hour northeast of Port Augusta, during the week. The very first issue that those farmers wanted to talk about was climate and climate change. So it's front of mind issue for the farming sector. We are keen to embrace the issues that haven't been embraced, and that is doing the research that's going to be necessary to equip farmers to make decisions for the future about how they farm and what they farm, where they farm, and for some, whether they farm at all.
Well, Peter Garrett says it's time for an audit of marginal land. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think there's a bit of misinformation about what Peter said, but I can tell you this. The opposition's position is there'll be no bureaucratic determination of where farmers farm. That's a decision for farmers. What we want to do is to equip them with the information to make the best possible decisions about their future. Economic farming is the only way it'll continue.
Mr McGauran, do you think there should be an audit of marginal land?
Of course not, and I'm afraid Peter Garrett, who'll be in charge of water and climate change issues, if there should be a Rudd government, gave the game away. But in any event, we don't believe in bureaucrats or politicians playing God and drawing lines on maps. We believe that there's viable small farms in low rainfall areas, just as some are not. But that is the decision for each individual farm enterprise or family to make for themselves.
So the market will decide?
They'll decide for themselves, and we'll give them a great deal of knowledge and assistance and at times financial support to reach that decision. And in fact, we have a $5,000 grant for all farmers in exceptional circumstance declared areas, which is now 70% of Australia's agricultural landmass, to get that sort of advice, to get objective and independent financial advice as to how they do their businesses and what are their options for the future.
Well, if we can turn to GM, Senator O'Brien, where do you stand on GM? Given climate change is occurring, a lot of people say GM technology is Australian agriculture's best answer to dealing with climate change.
And I've heard those arguments, and I've heard the arguments against GM, and I note that the Land has done a recent survey of farmers that suggests that the majority of farmers don't support GM. But the position that the federal opposition take on GM is that the federal government's role is should be the honest broker, dealing with the issues, the science, the environmental issues, the human health issues that are raised in the context of the debate. I don't believe that this issue needs a federal government that acts as an activist on the issue. I think we've got to be able to be seen as the honest broker, so that if it's possible to take the debate forward, that we will take the debate forward. And I've been talking to those on both sides of the equation, and I think they welcome that message. They don't want this to be a political issue. They want it resolved on the science.
Will you say that the states will decide, if there's a Labor government, the states can decide if they lift the moratoriums or not? Surely we could expect some leadership at a federal level.
Well, we want to lead in relation to the science, and we support the role of the gene technology regulator to be the honest broker in relation to the argument. We don't want the issue resolved because a particular entity has a strong economic case to get the crops in the ground, nor do we want it resolved because there's a political argument that runs against it on emotion and not on science.
Mr McGauran, what do you think about the Labor plan to let the states decide about the moratoriums?
Oh, it's sheer cowardness, and Senator O'Brien and the Labor Party have to get off the fence and make a decision. He speaks about the Commonwealth being the honest broker. This year alone, the coalition government has been the honest broker. We've released by the scientists, having commissioned it, 8 different reports on GM for information and debate and discussion. So there comes a point where you've got to stop discussing this. It's been discussed and debated for 10 or more years. We are elected to make a decision. Now, next April, the moratorium in the various states expires. I believe Victoria and New South Wales, in all likelihood, will lift the moratorium. The Commonwealth believes that farmers will make the choice. We don't support one production system over another, whether it be conventional, organic or GM. We believe, however, that the arguments for GM, given that it's safe for environment and health, as approved by the Gene Technology Regulator, should be left to the farmers.
Well, I think the reports that Mr McGauran refers to have been represented as making one case only, whereas information in those reports actually talk about some of the issues of caution that have been raised. But we, as I said, we don't believe this is an issue over which politicking should be played. If precautions have been taken, and if indeed, as the Minister says, we're likely to see movements from two of the major states in relation to lifting moratoria, well, that'll be a move towards the position Mr McGauran suggests.
Why wouldn't you have an opinion?
Well, I didn't interrupt you, Peter, so perhaps you'd let me finish what I was saying. If the states have got a view that GM can continue, we still think that the issues that need to be addressed are the ones relating to the science. And that's where the gene technology regulator role will be important, and that's where the Commonwealth, being seen as the honest broker, will be very important.
But it's pretty remarkable, isn't it, that an aspirant for ministerial office doesn't have an opinion or a judgment on the issue, but is preferred to defer to the states. I think that's unacceptable.
Well, I don't think that it's unacceptable, nor do those who I've spoken to think it's unacceptable for the Commonwealth to seek to play this issue straight down the line on the basis of science. And indeed, if we want to talk about quarantine, and I'll be very happy to talk about that, that's another issue we think should be played on the science as well.
We might move on to wheat. You surprised the wheat industry with your announcement about what you've called the single desk. Why did you change the policy given Labor said it would support the single desk?
Well, we don't believe we've changed from supporting the single desk, and I'm prepared to argue that case very vigorously. What we do say is that we've been discussing...
Sellers.
Well, our single desk with multiple sellers, let me compare our model to the default option in the legislation Mr McGauran put through the Parliament. The default option has the continuation of nominated Company B as having the right to export without a permit, but leaves the option open for everyone else to export with a permit without anyone's right of veto, either Mr McGauran or AWB. So what we say is the difference between that and our model is, instead of an application shipment by shipment, people will be able to apply, and AWB will have to apply to determine whether they're the an appropriate entity to be exporting Australia's wheat. So our position on the government's, and giving the deregulation of boxed or containerised wheat, the number of exporters is going to be quite large anyway. The question is, how many should there be, and how many should be exporting in bulk?
Well, Mr McGauran, Mr Tuckey likes the Labor option.
Yes, and Wilson Tuckey's honest about this, and for the life of me, I can't understand why Senator O'Brien and the Labor Party is not open and honest about it. They, like Wilson, want to deregulate the system. Their model is nothing like a single desk. There's no national pool, there's no buyer of last resort, there's no one single Australian seller in export markets. So why hide behind this facade that a multi-licence system is still a single desk? Our government listened to the overwhelming majority of wheat growers. More than 70% want a single desk, and that's the policy of the coalition.
Well, Mr McGauran fails to tell us about the Ralph report. He says it supports the position that he's taken, but he's refused repeatedly to release the Ralph report. I know plenty of growers who'd like to see it, but I can tell you that I've consulted quite widely with all of the interests and all of the issues being raised in the grower communities about the marketing of export wheat. There's no doubt that there's massive division, and you know, if policy on this issue is going to be determined by a vote of growers, that'll be an abrogation of leadership. And Mr McGauran was having a bit of a crack about GM. Where's the leadership from the coalition in relation to the best interest of growers? And if this issue is going to be determined on a vote, why didn't the government have one?
I agree. There is a strong constituency for complete deregulation of the single desk, which is Labor's policy. Of course, you could never deny that. Why would you want to? It's part of the debate within the grains industry. But the Ralph Committee, which we sent out specifically to numerous locations throughout the length and breadth of Australia, was to determine the growers' views themselves. They've invested in that single desk. I believe, like most of my colleagues in the Liberal and National parties, that it has great merit. So it's not just a matter of listening to more than 70% of grain growers. We actually believe that the single desk best serves grain growers' interests.
Well, I've got grain growers telling me that WEMA is funded to fail, and that when growers can't fund it, then deregulation will happen and growers will get the blame.
Wheat is a $5 billion industry, $3 billion exports. WEMA needs about $4 million working capital. I think that's within the possibilities of the industry
But they're
itself.
struggling to get it so far.
Some of the commercial banks are showing interest. I've spoken to the chairman of WEMA. Those discussions are ongoing, and we're continually monitoring the situation. But I wouldn't want to think that WEMA would fail for want of $4 million.
WEMA went to the growers and asked for money and got 14 cents a grower. That's a strong measure of failure, I would say. And if they have to have a model up and running by the 1st of March, and that's what the Prime Minister promised, then they have a more than Everest-like task to meet. So after the government said that it was a matter for WEMA to put it together, now we're seeing that there's strong indications that certainly Mr McGauran's side of the coalition wants to put the money up as well.
Well, will the federal government fund WEMA?
We've already funded them $250,000 for their business model to take to the commercial banks. It's a measure of the severity of the drought, so widespread that wheat growers can't just dip into their pockets, particularly when they feel they've already done it for the establishment of AWB, and that's why the single desk belongs to them. It's not a plaything for political parties.
Would you write a cheque for $4 million?
We're still considering it, but we don't believe WEMA's exhausted all of its commercial options.
If I could ask you about live exports, Mr McGauran, does the industry have your support?
Totally and fully. It operates to world's best practice. I think we've got to stop apologising for it. We lead the world. We've got the lowest mortality rates, almost to the extent of on-farm mortality rates. No other country comes anywhere near our transport or post-arrival systems, and it is a billion-dollar industry. It underpins domestic prices. There are 12,000 people directly dependent on it. It is an industry to be proud of, even as we strive to improve it, to meet Australian community demands and work with our partners in the Middle East especially.
Senator O'Brien, how would you treat the live export trade?
We understand that there are parts of this country that totally depend on the live export trade. They have no other markets to sell to. We also understand that it's a significant player in domestic markets, which has an impact on price. And there are some animals that probably don't have another market that they can be easily sent to. I also have to recognise that of all of the issues on which I receive correspondence from the public, live exports is the issue on which I receive an overwhelming weight of negative correspondence. I while supportive, a critic of the transportation system during the MV Courtney catastrophe, and frankly we saw some recommendations come from an inquiry that the government commissioned. I'm not convinced that all of them have been fully commissioned, but now the problem seems to be the slaughter arrangements overseas. We need to have a look at that, and we'll have more to say about that. But it isn't an easy option, and the problem that the industry faces, and I've told the industry this, is that if it comes to the point where the Australian public do not accept that animal welfare concerns are properly being met, governments of any persuasion will be faced with a difficult decision and will probably be almost forced to shut it down. So we have to deal with it. We have to deal with it. Well, I didn't interrupt you again. I didn't interrupt you before. I have told this to the industry. This is not the policy that we espouse, but if these problems are not dealt with, if the Australian public is not confident that animal welfare concerns are addressed, then the pressure on government will be enormous. Now, what I am saying and what I've said to the industry is that we understand the dynamics of the industry and we want to work with the industry, but if there are issues that can be better dealt with, and I think there are, then we need to work with the industry to get the settings right, because ultimately it doesn't matter what Peter McGauran or I think. The pressure from the public will determine a position on this, and unless we get it right, it won't be in the interest of farmers, and I'm about getting outcomes that are in the interest of farmers.
Mr. McGauran?
Well, that's just a remarkable bombshell for Senator O'Brien to drop. He has just said, his exact words were, if the pressure gets too much, then the industry will have to stop. These are organised letter-writing campaigns. He speaks of getting a lot of representations from the public, so do I, but they are attributable to Animals Australia and other extremist groups. The idea that you would cave into that instead of meet the challenge, educate the general public. As I said earlier on, we've got to stop apologising for having the best standards and having the highest animal welfare standards that match the treatment of sheep and cattle on farm. So the idea that the Labor Party would cave into an organised extremist campaign and stop the trade is frightening.
Well, I think the fact of the matter is this government had its head in the stand before the MV Courtney problem. We forced the government to deal with the problems of transportation. They now claim, they couldn't before, that we've got the standards right. Now, the attack on the industry is now about the slaughter arrangements overseas, and it's not just the extremist organisations, as Mr McGauran puts it, that have issues about this. There are lots of ordinary Australians who see the stories on TV, and it may be that they exaggerate the case. In some cases, I suspect that's true.
But realistically, what can Australia do about what happens
I think there are a lot of
overseas?
things we can do. We've done things so far. We've made some breakthroughs. Most of the carriers aren't Australian. Most of the ships that carry our animals aren't Australian. We've invested in some markets in relation to slaughter arrangements already, and there's no doubt more that can be done. The live exporters talk to me about some of the model slaughter arrangements they've got in Southeast Asia, for example. There's more that can be done, and I think we have to do it.
Senator O'Brien, how confident are you that you're going to be Australia's next Agriculture Minister?
Well, I hope we win the election. That's the first prerequisite, and we'll just keep working at trying to do that. Ultimately, Kevin Rudd will make the decision about who has which portfolio. I'm very happy indeed. I'm putting my hand up to take the portfolio, and I hope that the work I'm doing will convince Kevin that's the right decision.
And Mr McGauran, if the Coalition wins, would you like to continue being Agriculture Minister?
The premise of your question is if the Coalition wins. That's what we're totally focused on at the moment, and the idea of apportioning ministries or high office afterwards is the last thing on our mind. But I've been buoyed by the support of my colleagues, both Liberal and National Party. We've got complex, difficult issues to work through, and we have vigorous debates. But we work with the farm organisations and the general farming community, and that gives me encouragement to take a role in agriculture in one form or another in the next coalition government.
Gentlemen, thank you for joining us on Landline.
Thanks, Pip.
Thank you.
As you just heard, Labor and the Coalition are at odds over live animal exports.